Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Trade Justice Alliance Sunday night webinar. This webinar is for October 28th, 2018. The topic of tonight's discussion is NAFTA 2, Not Making Farmers Great Again. And tonight we're very pleased to welcome Karen Hansen-Kuhn, who is the Director of Trade and Global Governance at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. We also welcome Terry Boehm, who is the former president and vice president of the Canadian National Farmers Union. And I would just like to say a few words. We in the trade justice movement recognized arguably that some of the absolute worst damage to workers and to food sovereignty rights is the ongoing damage brought on by the agricultural policies of NAFTA, CAFTA, and of other corporate design trade agreements. And following in that vein, the current iteration of NAFTA, renamed the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, and this will continue to attack sovereign protections that agribusiness monopoly interests view as barriers to trade. We've heard about the bully tactics of the Trump administration when it comes to Canada's dairy and grain systems, and we also are quite familiar with the survival migrant crises as Mexico and other Latin American countries' citizens have faced that terrible decision after losing their farms to leave their homes and risk their lives as a response to U.S. subsidized agriculture, which has been dumped on once vibrant farming economies. The new NAFTA continues the march of agribusiness monopoly over state and local food producer protections, and it also streamlines biotechnology and the continuing intentional bankruptcies of family farms and dairy of all three countries. Tonight's speakers will speak to these failings, and we also have to remember that we in the trade justice movement must speak out against them, and we must advocate for sustainable trade goals. So before we move on, I'm just going to mention a couple of technical details. First, if you're on the phone now, you know we use phone for audio, and we use, obviously, an online meeting room for our visuals. If you are in phone only and you would like to access the visuals, just go to tradejustice.net/webinar and log in with your username. You can use your name as your username, and don't worry about a password. You can visit our website at tradejustice.net and our Facebook group at Trade Justice Alliance. We have only one rule for our chat box, and that is to please be respectful of our wonderful guest speakers and attendees. My name is Harriet Haywood. I'm going to be your moderator tonight, and I am an organizer with People Demanding Action, and I am a coordinator with the Trade Justice Alliance Working Group. So if you would like to opt in to receive text reminders for future webinars, we have our webinars about once a month. You'll get a reminder about 2 hours before they begin on your mobile phone. Text webinar reminder in all caps to 917-791-1131. I have a couple of announcements to make this evening. It's with a very heavy heart that I make these announcements. This past week has been deeply troubling. First, on Wednesday, a white supremacist in Kentucky murdered 2 people of color, and just yesterday a shocking hate crime was committed at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. We know in Pittsburgh at least 11 innocent people attending services were murdered, and at least 6 other people were wounded. We would like to offer our sincere condolences and our solidarity to all the victims of these atrocious hate crimes. And we are also deeply troubled by the bombs also that were sent to a number of political figures and their supporters this past week. You know, I think we share the feeling that the level of anger across this country today is unprecedented. At least in my lifetime it is. And we at Trade Justice Alliance offer our sincere condolences and solidarity to all who are affected. And we really wish that peace will prevail. Also, I would like to acknowledge the twin crises of violence and hunger that is plaguing the people of Honduras and other countries of Latin America, also the victims of economic backlash from trade deals like CAFTA and Nafta and government-sponsored militarism. While Trump's response is to send troops to the border, we would like to mention that Mexico's President-elect AMLO is asking the U.S. and Canada to consider supporting economic growth in affected countries instead of trying to solve everything by violence and force. AMLO said, "The main right is the right to life, to go out and to seek to mitigate hunger," and the opposite approach of Peña Nieto and, unfortunately, our own president. AMLO will take office on December 1st, so we really are standing behind him in these statements. And we must support and work in solidarity with those forced into survival migrations. I would now like to introduce our first speaker, Karen Hansen-Kuhn. Karen Hansen-Kuhn is the Director of Trade and Global Governance at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, or IATP. She has been working on trade and economic justice since the beginning of the Nafta debate. She has published so many articles on U.S. economic justice since the beginning of the Nafta debates, and she has published articles on U.S. trade and agriculture policies. Also, the impacts of U.S. biofuels policies on food security and on women and food crises. She started to learn about the challenges facing farmers as a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay, where she worked with a rural cooperative. Karen was the international coordinator of the Alliance for Responsible Trade, a U.S. multi-sectoral coalition promoting just and sustainable trade until 2005. After that, she was policy director at the U.S. Office of Action Aid, an international development organization. Karen Hansen-Kuhn holds a Bachelor's of Science in International Business from the University of Colorado and a Master's degree in International Development from the American University. Welcome, Karen.
Hello. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Welcome.
So I want to talk tonight both about what the impacts of NAFTA have been, especially in the U.S. and Mexico, and what we know so far about what this new agreement might be. Next slide. So I guess I want to start first with some context, which I think is some of the issues that Harriet was just raising. I think when I was in Mexico last week, and a journalist asked me, he says, well, we in Mexico have lost from this deal. Has the U.S. won? And I said, as all of you know, it's not countries that win or lose. It is people in different sectors on both sides. But we have this vicious cycle going on in agriculture. Since the beginning of NAFTA, there has been a flood of cheap corn going to Mexico that has displaced, depending on how you count it, between 2 and 5 million Mexican farmers. At the same time, we have a situation where supply chains have become very integrated. I read a statistic on a USDA website that a cow can cross the border 4 times in its life between being a calf, being fattened, being processed, becoming leather. And all of these cycles are integrated in a way that gives farmers and ranchers fewer options and concentrates corporate power. So we have a situation in the U.S. now where it's become much harder for small and medium-scale farmers to make a living. We have lost, according to USDA statistics, nearly 250,000 family farms, small and medium-scale farms, since NAFTA began. At the same time, concentration has increased pretty dramatically. In the meat sector, for example, 4 firms control 80% of meat processing in the United States. So, and then the cycle starts again. Next slide. So, when they announced they were going to renegotiate NAFTA, we got together with some of our partners in the family farm movement in the United States, and we set out a list of demands for what it should be. So this was the National Family Farm Coalition, National Farmers Union, Rural Coalition, Food and Water Watch, RCAF, which is a group of independent ranchers, and us. And like most civil society groups, we pushed hard for better labor and environment standards, for an end to investor-state dispute settlement, and for greater transparency in the process. We also had some agriculture-specific demands. First, and I think what attracted a lot of attention, was to restore country of origin labeling for meat. This was a program that was dismantled after Mexico and Canada challenged the program as being trade distorting. This is an issue where we gained no ground. This was not brought out in the new NAFTA. We also insisted on better mechanisms to deal with dumping. I'll talk a little bit more about U.S. dumping of corn, which has devastated Mexican farmers, but also there are fruit and vegetable growers in the U.S., particularly tomato growers in the southeast, who've been affected by what they allege is dumping of those products. And there is no good mechanism to deal with that, to quickly investigate these cases and find a resolution that is fair. On that issue, too, there was no progress. We have stated many times our support for Canada's dairy supply management program and the fact that we should be learning from that experience rather than trying to dismantle it. And I know Terry will be talking more about that, so I'll leave that one. And then respect and protect migrant labor. Now, in the chapter on labor rights, there are some good articles. There is an article 23.8 that insists that the parties protect and respect rights of migrant workers, no matter which country, whether they are national or not. With the labor chapter, the big question mark is whether it will be at all enforceable or not, and that is still very much unresolved. So we set out these demands not out of, I think, excessive optimism, but because we thought it was important right from the beginning to start talking about precisely what we need. We also need a better farm bill. There's no doubt about that. These policies go hand in hand. Next slide. So about the time that NAFTA started, we had the 1996 Farm Bill, which really withdrew a lot of the last vestiges of supply management in the U.S. and pressured farmers to get big or get out and to make up for falling prices by increasing production. So here you can see dumping rates for corn, wheat, and rice. Now, dumping is the extent to which a product is sold at below its cost of production. IATP has been calculating dumping rates on a number of crops for something like 20 years. And you can see here all of the bars where that are above the zero line, that's where there was dumping. And it was, most years, with some exceptions, say with the 2012 drought or the food price crisis in 2008, in most years there was significant dumping of U.S. crops. So on average, since NAFTA began, corn has been exported at 33% below the cost of production, wheat at 44%, rice at 34%. And in 2017, the figures were 9% for corn, 38% for wheat, 3% for rice. Now, clearly, this is bad for farmers in developing countries. It's bad for U.S. farmers, too. As I said, we're losing family farms. Farms are becoming much bigger. And because farmers can't truly make up the full cost of production, they're not able to invest in improving soils, in better practices, or really most of them have to seek off-farm income. USDA estimates that this year the average income from farm activities for farming families will be negative $1,600. So this has been bad for people on both sides of the border. Now, I mentioned these three crops specifically because of the new plans in Mexico. Next slide. It is really exciting what they have planned in Mexico. Last year, something like 100 Mexican farm organizations came together for what they call the Plan de Ayala 21st Century. The Plan de Ayala was originally a plan that Emiliano Zapata supported in 1911 during the Mexican Revolution. This takes it into the 21st century, and it was a series of demands to restore Mexican agriculture. AMLO formally supported this during his campaign, and the farm groups turned out millions of votes for him. And so now the groups have come together in the Movimiento Campesino, the farmers' movement essentially, and they meet weekly to make sure this is going to happen. I attended one of their meetings last week, and there's not a lot in writing yet. They're working this out right now, but the main elements are to achieve self-sufficiency in corn, wheat, rice, and meat, one thing, where at this point Mexico imports a significant portion of each of those crops, and to support this through guaranteed prices for small-scale producers. There are plans to try to use biofertilizers as much as possible, and still a commitment not to use GMO seeds. And in addition, they would have set up a series of local food banks and basic food baskets to make sure people have both better incomes and more to eat. It's an exciting new plan. Next slide. As I said, there's not much in writing yet. This came out just a few days ago from Victor Suarez, who will be the new Undersecretary for Food Self-Sufficiency. And he shows here their plans for this guarantee prices. So if you look on the left corner, left side where it says maize or corn, they are planning what amounts to about $7.35 a bushel for corn. Now they're basing this on the price at the Chicago Board of Trade with an adjustment for transport. But the U.S. price right now for corn is about half that, it's about $3.60. So this would only be given to farmers with farms less than 5 hectares, which is 20-some acres, and only up to 20 tons. So it's limited, but the idea is to pour a lot of direct support into the small-scale farmers who have so much potential but who have been ignored for so many years. And these plans, I mean, if you look at this, we're talking about 2019. In some cases, they're hoping even the end of 2018. They're planning to settle the budget by December. So they are moving forward at breakneck speed to get this done. And everyone I talked to there insisted that this is a serious program, that there is full buy-in from the government. Next slide. So one challenge, and I'm sure they'll face many, is what's in this new Nafta that could block some of those changes. I looked particularly at the chapter on agriculture. So there's one article I've got listed here, 3.6.1, which says basically, sure, countries will support their agriculture, but that agriculture should not distort trade. Well, I'm going to guess that a program that's designed to achieve self-sufficiency in corn, for example, to import a whole lot less corn, is going to distort trade. The parties agree not to use the ability they have under WTO rules for agricultural safeguards. So this would be temporary tariffs if there's import surges or prices go haywire. So they stand down from using those. There's a new annex that facilitates agricultural biotechnology, and in the chapter on intellectual property rights, a provision insisting that Mexico sign and enforce a treaty that's called UPA of 1991 that restricts saving and sharing of seeds. So these are all pretty serious obstacles. One thing I want to point out, too, that was striking when I was in Mexico, you and I can go online, we can see the text, and we can try and figure this out. The text is not available in Spanish yet. All that has been published in Mexico is a 40-page PR summary. So there has been very little direct debate yet in Mexico about what this could mean. And a lot of people I talked to were really concerned about the intention to sign this agreement 2 days before AMLO comes into office. Now, he has agreed to this. I think he doesn't want to be the president who signed this new Nafta. So this is a problem, but the Mexican groups are demanding that the text be published in English and that it not be signed until there is a full debate about what this could mean. Next slide. Can you move? Okay, great. So a lot of these rules, you can look at some things in the agricultural chapter, but there are things that work together that will create new obstacles to what they're trying to do in Mexico, but also to reforming our own food system. So in the section on agricultural biotechnology, it says that corn, for example, would only be categorized as yellow or white corn under WTO rules, without any special distinction for GMO corn or for some of the new gene editing CRISPR technologies. There are new rules on low-level presence of ag tech commodities, so basically GMO contamination of crops going into Mexico. So, but without defining what is low level. We don't know if low level means 1% or 20%. And this is a problem not only because it contaminates the feed that's going to the animals or that people might be eating, but it ends up becoming planted as well. So there is genetic contamination in Mexico, for example, because of the corn that's being exported there or to Mexico. There's a new chapter that I think we should all be paying a lot of attention to, Chapter 28, on what's called good regulatory practices. Basically, what it establishes is a sort of gauntlet where if there are new rules or even existing rules, they have to be opened up to notice and comment by corporations or whoever else on whether it's the best option, whether it distorts trade, whether there's some kind of science showing that there are better options. Anyway, it sets up a lot. So for new rules, new regulations under this chapter, say there's a new rule on a pesticide. The government would have to give a year notice to the other parties, allow them to comment in whatever way they want to, and set up. So it sets up this process that makes it a lot harder to make changes to rules that are already in place or ones that are being proposed. What's in this chapter is something that was discussed in the transatlantic trade talks, but this is more binding. Unlike the labor chapter, as far as we can tell, this chapter is very explicitly binding and subject to dispute resolution, state-to-state dispute resolution. It also has links to the chapters on cosmetics, on chemicals, on different annexes. So this is something we all need to be studying a lot more because I think it could be a big problem. And then finally I would mention in the sections in the agriculture chapter and in the chapter on sanitary and phytosanitary standards, there is reliance on what they call best available science. And what that means is that if the U.S., for example, is passing new rules on a pesticide or a new seed, they can rely on unpublished studies from corporations protected as confidential business information. So they're relying on information that is unavailable for peer review or any other way to see if it's really legitimate science. So all of these work together, not so much to say, yes, there will be GMOs, but to create a lot of obstacles to making change and to make it easier for these goods to be flowing even when there's a lot of opposition. Next slide. So it's not over yet. People may know that even though the text was published on October 1st, it is still being negotiated. Just last week, Lighthizer asked Mexico for some new concessions. The labor chapter is being debated whether or not it might become more enforceable. We're not really sure all of the changes that might be made. But I think, my concern when I was in Mexico is that the Mexican Senate and the U.S. Senate, or Congress for that matter, should be pushing for changes now that they see what the draft is. But anyway, that discussion is still going on. So it's, one very big question for unions, of course, is whether the chapter on labor rights will be enforceable. And this is something people I talked to in Mexico were also concerned about. There are new provisions in the agreement on access to biological medicines that would extend patents to 10 years. So that's something that would be a big problem for at least Mexico, and perhaps Terry can tell us if that's an issue in Canada as well. But in any case, I think most of us would agree with our friends in Mexico that this simply can't move forward until there is some way to debate what it really might mean. For the most part, for agriculture, this is more of the same. This is locking in the existing system, but we have these new elements on top of it that make it harder to get the kinds of reforms we need and really could block a lot of the really promising changes that are being debated in Mexico. So I think that I would leave it here. I think there's probably room for a lot of questions, but also I hope Terry is there because there is a lot to say about what could happen in Canada as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure Terry has gotten here yet, which is kind of surprising. I know he is also a farmer, but he knows, he's very excited to do the webinar. But I'm wondering if maybe he's a little confused by the timing, the time zone difference. So not sure. But let's see, Terry, are you with us? Because I don't see you. Carrie, you don't see him in the
no, I don't see him on
call
host
board. Maybe what we should do is proceed with some questions for Karen, and then we will just pray that Terry gets on because he has a very interesting talk planned for us. So, Karen, does that sound good? You can maybe open the line for some questions. I'll start with a question that'll give people a chance. You can press *6 on your keypad on your phone, and then when prompted, press the 1, and that will put you into the queue for Karen, and you can ask your question. Just when you get on, just tell us who you are, and then actually ask a question. Thank you. I have a question, Karen. This chapter 28, I'm assuming this is what they call the regulatory review chapter that we've been reading about for a while. What's your opinion on that? Do you believe that basically that is going to, in a sense, for corporations, basically, since they are limiting the investor-state dispute settlement provisions to quite a large extent, do you think this is basically going to kind of take the place of the investor-state because then they'll be able to dispute it at the WTO?
It's a good question. I think we need to study it more, but I would say, so in the original NAFTA, there was something like this. It was 2 paragraphs that basically said countries should talk to each other about new rules. And in TPP, they tried for more, but what ended up was voluntary. So this goes, as far as I can tell, even farther than what was talked about in TTIP. But yeah, it is this process of allowing we have this process in the U.S. under OIRA where laws can get delayed for years going through different kinds of reviews. So I think the part that's not clear to me yet, and I'm not a lawyer, is whether this is locking in the system we have in the United States and other countries, or if it goes beyond what we have here. My colleague Sharon Treat, who's been working on this, thinks that it does go beyond, particularly that they can have retroactive review. So if there is some law that's already on the books, that can be brought up for review. This provision, this kind of chapter, is included in the CETA, the agreement between Canada and Europe, which has been going on for a little while now. There are now 19 regulatory commissions examining different kinds of laws. And what we hear from partners in Canada and Europe is that there is just no way for them to keep track of all of those, and very little transparency. I would say it's probably also there with an eye to the negotiations that could be starting. They've asked for permission to negotiate with Japan, Europe, and the UK. So my guess is it's also they would try and replicate it there. I would also say, one caution on ISDS. It is true that it's great that between Canada and the U.S. we won't have that anymore. But people I talked to in Mexico weren't so impressed with the change because there it still includes energy, telecommunications, infrastructure, a lot of the big ticket sectors that would be subject, have been subject to dispute. Mm-hmm. So I think, to me, when I see this good regulatory chapter, I think we really need to figure out what that means both for other countries and our own. But I think it is a big concern. Yes,
and of course the ISDS with Mexico and climate change, it opens up a whole other ball of wax right there. So
sure.
The fact that these, I believe, 9 fossil fuel corporations are allowed to continue with these 13 oil and gas contracts in Mexico, that does nothing for climate. So okay. Do we have anybody in the queue, Carrie?
We do. Okay, our first question comes from Stan. Stan, your line is open.
Hi, thanks. This is Stan Sorcher in Seattle. Karen, you were talking about commodity prices being less than the price of production, and partly that's overproduction by factory farms. But Canada deals with this by having supply management. And we used to have supply management, and we took it apart. To what extent do family farmers in the United States think that Canada has a better answer than we do? And to what extent do family farmers say, no, we just need to export more of our production? Do you have a sense, are there family farm organizations that have taken a stand, for or against supply management in the United States?
Yeah, I think the National Family Farm Coalition has said a lot about this, also the National Farmers Union. I think there's, what I hear pretty consistently from groups like those and even some bigger farmers is that, in the first place, Mexico's dairy market, even if it was liberalized completely, is nowhere near big enough to even make a dent in the problem of U.S. dairy farmers. The Mexican dairy market altogether is about the size of what Wisconsin produces. So, what I hear from people from NFU and NFSC is that, we should be learning from that system. It is not perfect, and I think Terry could probably tell us about that, but it has kept farmers on their farms, on their lands, a lot better than in the U.S. It has achieved a kind of balance between supply and demand that has worked really well. So what we hear from family farm groups is they would love to have that kind of system here. I think NFSC has been especially vocal about that one, but in the statements we've made, with we've had some trinational press statements, too, along those lines, where Mexican farmers, too, think, this is something we should be learning from. We don't have to go back to the past, but we can learn from this thing that is working now.
Mm-hmm. By the way, I did just talk to Terry, so he will be joining us. So not sure about what the time thing is, but he's going to be on. So.
All right.
Ahead.
Well, we have one more person in the queue so far.
Okay.
Caller at area code 870. Your line is open.
Hello, my name is David Richards. I live in Arkansas, and thank you for all that you do, the good information that you give out. My question was, could you tell me anything about the debate with the environmental protections and if there will be any enforceable mechanisms? Thank you.
Well, that's not my area of expertise, but I will say Sierra Club has come out pretty firmly against this agreement. I think, on the one hand, people think it is a step forward that they have eliminated what's called the proportional sharing clause under Nafta, which required that Canada continue to export the same percentage of energy products to the U.S. even if conditions were to change. So that's a step forward. On the other hand, previous trade agreements have protected 7 multilateral environment agreements. This one only honors 3. And even in areas where there has been some progress on the environment, it is not at all clear that chapter will be enforceable. People are also raising a lot of concerns about the new chapter on energy, which will mean more fossil fuel drilling, and the fact that climate change is not mentioned at all in this agreement. So I haven't heard of any, I could be wrong, but I haven't heard of any environmental groups supporting the agreement as it is now. And I would say even if it's enforceable, most of them think there's other issues besides the labor chapter that would be a concern. But yeah, there are a lot of environmental concerns. I would look especially to materials Sierra Club has put out on that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. We had the Ben Beachy on last month, so he talked about, all of the issues, the environmental issues. So, if you look at the Trump administration and their attitude towards climate change and environmental policies, they're just atrocious. So I don't think we can expect very much benefit in the trade agreement. So is there anyone else in the queue right now, or is that pretty much?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
And Terry, is that you?
Yes, I'm just...
hi, Terry.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
You got here just in time.
That's okay. Perfect.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Karen.
Okay. So thank you, Karen. You might want to continue to stick with us too, Karen, because I'm sure people will think of some other questions to ask once you're gone.
Sure, and
so
I'm eager to hear what Terry has to say.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Terry Baum. He is a third-generation family farmer. He farms in Colonsay, Allen District of the province of Saskatchewan, Canada. His farm produces wheat, barley, peas, lentils, flax, mustard, and canola and rye, and that is on approximately 4,000 acres. I can't even imagine a farm that size. There is no GMO production of any of their crops because Terry refuses to enter into this kind of dependency and control arrangements that come from using them. Terry Baum has served on the boards of numerous cooperatives and commissions. He is the former vice president and also president of the Canadian National Farmers Union. Terry analyzes and comments on intellectual property rights with regard to seeds, trade agreements, rail transport legislation, grain grading regulation, and marketing. And he has been a frequent expert witness appearing before Canadian parliamentary committees. Terry Baum is a longtime activist also in advocating for social and economic justice for farmers and for all citizens. He speaks internationally and domestically on subjects in this regard. We are so pleased that he was able to take time. We know he's got an extremely busy life, and so we really appreciate that he is giving us his time tonight for this webinar. Welcome, Terry Bohm.
Well, thank you, and I apologize for the glitch on the times, but anyway, here I am.
That's okay. Thank you. All right.
So, yeah, so I guess the first slide is up for those of you there, and I just thought I'd give a little statistical background of Canadian agriculture. The annual farm receipts or sales are $47 billion. Farmers net about $1.2 billion annually out of that $47 billion. We're less than 200,000 farmers in Canada now, and it's a huge country. And that's unfortunately been part of the agenda, this neoliberal trade agenda, partially, and partially other agricultural policies that have really not very many people see opportunities in agriculture anymore because of the high debt loads, low returns, etc. And as you can see in this slide, we have 102 billion Canadian dollars of debt being held amongst those 193,000 farmers. And even at today's low interest rates, the net returns to farmers really only cover the interest rates of the debt, and it's rising every year. Okay, next slide, please. Now, Saskatchewan, where I'm from, we have about 64 million acres of farmland. It's an interesting place. Of course, I'm biased, but I'm from there. But it was actually the center of the Canadian Dust Bowl, Alberta and Saskatchewan, during the 1930s, and so it was hit with the double whammy of environmental disaster along with the economic depression. What that led to was actually people started to really think differently or increasingly differently about their politics. So in 1944, we elected the CCF government of Tommy Douglas, and that was considered a socialist government, I guess. And the Douglas government was quite successful in introducing rural electrification and a number of things. And they introduced Medicare in the this resulted in an actual doctor's strike in the early 1960s that anyway, this was resolved, and Saskatchewan was the first place where we had the government as a single payer and citizens not paying anything for their health care. And that's been the case since then, and it's become sort of a hallmark of Canadian society as it was adopted across the country later. And one of your favorite presidents, Ronald Reagan, at the time was recording record albums that were supposed to be listened to and discussed, discussing the evils of socialized medicine in Saskatchewan. The other little aside is that the Douglas government in the 1940s created a human rights declaration for the province, which Lester Pearson, a latter Prime Minister of Canada, took to the UN in the founding conference in San Francisco, and this was used as the basis of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. Okay, next slide. Canada, unfortunately, has since the it has a long history of trade deals, reciprocity, going way back with Britain and other deals with the U.S. But in the last 30 years, there's been a real mania for trade deals, along with adopting, unfortunately, a very strong neoliberal philosophy in terms of economics, in terms of institutions and policy making, and so many of the institutions that we had have been destroyed as a function of the idea that society isn't really a collective institution. It's a business operation in a gross oversimplification. So the latest ones, of course, are CETA, which have the Orwellian names, although this one's rather accurate, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. The more Orwellian name is the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Canada moved into and changed the title of the agreement to the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's anything but. Next slide, please. So here's a sample, just a little quick list, what we've lost in the last 25 years of free trade in terms of institutional arrangements, partly because of trade agreements and partly because of that neoliberal philosophy and the machinations of assorted governments. Our previous Prime Minister Harper, in particular, was a nasty character, but it crosses party lines in terms of the destruction. But we used to have a two-price wheat system where Canadian millers paid actually almost double what the market price was for Canadian wheat. And bread, actually, in the supermarket was much cheaper then, oddly. And we lost the Canadian Wheat Board, which was a marketing agency that operated on behalf of Western farmers, so that anyone buying Canadian wheat and barley had to deal with the Wheat Board. So it was able to achieve premium prices and returned everything other than administration costs to the farmer, which is a sharp contrast to the world we're in now, where we're selling to Cargill and Louis Dreyfus and the handful of multinational grain companies. We had the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act, which actually grew out of the 1930s, the devastation of soil drifting, etc. That has been shut down. Community pastures, they've been shut down and are for sale. And we once had the largest grain handling cooperatives in the world. These were called the Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba wheat pools, not wheat boards, but pools. And the pooling idea was based on a Chicago lawyer's plan called the Shapiro Plan in the 1920s. And it was about orderly marketing so that, gluts didn't come onto the market and destroy farmers' income all at once when they had to sell, and an assortment of other things. Shapiro was an interesting guy, and he was also the guy that Henry Ford published an anti-Semitic Ford newspaper, and Shapiro shut that down. He finally sued Ford, and so a little bit of American history there, actually. Next slide, please. Now, Canadian supply management has been contentious. The Canadian Wheat Board was always under attack. Over 14 cases brought against it by the U.S. government as an unfair trader, and they lost every time under the previous Nafta commissions. The board was found to be a proper trader. But supply management has been under attack from around the world. I mean, it's one of these ideas that's not neoliberal. It's a different way about thinking about things, and it was actually my organization, the National Farmers Union, that was the impetus for the creation of this, amongst other pressures. And it's called the SM5. There are 5 so-called commodities that are supply managed in Canada, and the system works rather well. There's no government subsidies required because the various dairy commissions negotiate with the processors, and they calculate a cost of production plus a reasonable margin of profit for farmers, and when things change like fuel costs or feed costs, etc., that's calculated in. The processors like it because they receive a very consistent, high-quality supply of the various products. And there's a ongoing myth that these products cost more in Canada than in Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S. And in reality, statistical studies have found that the prices are almost identical, except that farmers get a fair return. They aren't bankrupted in those industries. And the system is about producing for the domestic market. It's divided into regions. And under the GATT, this was an acceptable system, but when the WTO came along, supply management was no longer looked upon as an appropriate mechanism, and has been under steady attack ever since. Of course, when you're supplying your domestic market, you have to keep foreign supplies out, and the trade-off has been is that Canada has very high tariffs on imported products in the supply managed industry. The problem is that supply management in these trade agreements, whether it be CETA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, others, and now the USMCA, is that the Canadians are pressured into negotiating market access to players in each of those engaged in those agreements, and so with each agreement we've lost about 3.5% market to other players in other trade agreements, including the U.S. MCA. We also have to change our milk pricing strategy. And one other aside is that in Canada, we don't use RGBH, the bovine growth hormone. It's banned in Canada because of actually it was, again, the NFU was able to access leaked material that Monsanto had researched and found that it was carcinogenic to cows, harmful to cows, and the Canadian government banned that product. So we don't have cows that are using bovine growth hormone to produce milk in Canada. Next slide, please. Now, the grain grading system in Canada, we have an old, actually it was created out of agitation by farmers that they were being cheated on weights on dockage, like the weed seeds or non-grain entities and whatnot, and by the companies that they were delivering their grain to. So the Canada Grain Act was created, and the Canadian Grain Commission was created with the Canada Grain Act, and it was mandated to act in the interests of the grain producers. And so we have a grain grading system that is modified from time to time, but it's modified in a way or it's supposed to be, in a way that benefits producers. So it looks at the quality parameters that are coming in every harvest and adjusts the grading to maximize return to farmers rather than the opposite way around with large grain companies. The other very important thing about the Canadian Grain Commission and the Canada Grain Act is that grain companies cannot refuse delivery from farmers, so they can't decide who they do business with and who they do not, or who they put out of business, or hold the threat of not dealing with a farmer and organizing to sort of blacklist farmers. So they can't do that, and that's critically important. The other thing is that when there's a dispute about the quality of the farmer's grain and when he delivers it to a grain company, he is able to say, I wish to have a Canadian Grain Commission grade it, and the companies must comply, and they the Grain Commission is the final ruler, so the farmer doesn't have the expense of going to courts or things like that, and the grain companies must respect the ruling as must the farmer. So it puts them on a even playing field, at least as far as grading goes. Now, Canadian grain, we've focused on in Western Canada and producing, which is the main production area in Canada, of high-quality wheat in particular. It's blended with lower-quality wheats around the world to bring up their baking characteristics. And we've done that to a certain extent at the expense of yield, and that's a function of trying to achieve premium prices and the extremely high rail transport costs that we experience because where I am, I'm 1,600 kilometers from any sort of water port, either fresh water on the Great Lakes or salt water at Vancouver. And that rail transport, it's somewhat hidden now since we lost the Canadian Wheat Board, but it's the single biggest cost to a Western farmer. And under the USMCA for wheat, the U.S. government has demanded and has achieved in this agreement that U.S. wheat be treated the same as Canadian wheat in the Canadian market in terms of grading. They've also demanded and gotten variety registration or variety to be recognized. And this is particularly problematic in recent years. For actually several decades, 2 decades now, we've been fighting the introduction of GM wheat and had some success in Canada. Although there are cases of contamination from test plots, but they have been contained, the same as the case in the U.S. However, if GM wheat is introduced in the U.S. with this trade agreement, we would have to probably deal with the registration of that wheat in our variety registration system, and we would also be in a conundrum in terms of if it moved into the Canadian system and the grading parameters were treated the same, we could run into very serious problems, I think, with the rejection of Canadian grain. The other piece of this is that in the agreement, any Canadian grain destined for U.S. domestic consumption that goes out our West Coast ports cannot have the revenue cap freight rate applied to it. In Canada, we have a long history of railway, the farmers fighting railways, and freight rates are a particular concern amongst other things, including service. And we have what's called the maximum revenue entitlement, which puts a cap to a certain degree on rail freight rates for grain. This is because we are so far from port of any sort, and also for economic justice reasons. It's very generous to the railways, and it's based on actually American railway accounting standards that give a generous return to the railways on their investment, and they've been achieving beyond that. But nevertheless, this is something that is worrisome in terms of how that even would be administered, given that we're dealing with Cargill, Louis Dreyfus, Archer Daniels Midland, and et cetera, American grain companies. And I think what they've really achieved, and I think what they've been looking for a long time, is a continental grain market. And with this in wheat, now with Mexico, U.S., and Canada having to parallel grading or at least grade outside grain in exactly the same way as domestic grain, and the compliance measures on registering grain varieties, the grain companies have achieved that continental market without having to deal with those pesky regulations of the individual countries, or at least they have to streamline them. Of course, that's advantageous to them. It's not very advantageous to farmers, I think, in either three countries, in spite of what some right-wing farm organizations may think. And I guess that brings us to the next slide.
The one previous? This
no,
one?
actually, it kind of fits. Give me a warning if I'm going over time here.
No, you're fine. You're
okay.
fine. Yeah,
okay.
Don't worry about it.
All right. One of the what I'll do is I'll flip a little differently. The slide that's there, sort of the bottom half, that kind of works for where I was going with this discussion.
Okay.
Of course, the U.S. has the Sherman anti-trust laws that broke up, Carnegie Steel, and really came about because of the abuses of the railways in the U.S., the Vanderbilts, etc. And it was recognized at that time, as more than a century ago, that if you had too much power in too few hands, particularly economic power, it wasn't good for democracy. It wasn't good for economic justice for citizens, and these were broken up to a greater or lesser extent based on those ideas. Those ideas are even more valid now. The problem is both in Canada and the U.S. and other nations. I'm quite familiar with Europe and the CETA agreement. These agreements are actually creating entities that are far larger than the dominant players that were in the American economy of a century ago, and in the Canadian economy is the Canadian equivalents as well. And we're losing our ability to, or at least it's implied, and I don't think we lose our ability on any front if citizens finally stand up and say no. But nevertheless, within these trade agreements, the idea is to make sure that citizens don't get in the way of these mega consolidations and mergers and the power that flows from that. So this economic hegemony is being dictated through these agreements. And some people talk about one world governance. I don't believe in that in particular because I think, and I think it's borne out in how these agreements are put together, the nation state is critically important. Taxpayers are looked upon as appropriate to finance the judicial system, to give it validity, to enforce these agreements, to enforce the privileges, whether they're intellectual property privileges or regulatory privileges for these giant corporations. And I think that this inefficiency of and massive scale of these entities are really need to be looked at and dismantled, in particular as they get in the way of our ability to really talk about the public interest, to deal with climate change in an appropriate and serious and expeditious way, and a whole bunch of other social justice and economic justice problems. I guess I did flip away from the agricultural chemicals piece.
You want to talk about that?
Yep. Yeah, I guess I can just briefly.
Sure.
What, in particular, with intellectual property and copyright, utility patents, geographical indications, trademarks, patents, plant variety registration, plant variety protection systems, plant breeders' rights. These agreements enforce all of those mechanisms much more harshly and than in the past. Just as an example, in the CETA agreement, any party alleged to have infringed on an intellectual property right is to be subjected to the seizure of their movable and immovable property, the freezing of bank accounts, and they have to supply financial data. And any third party alleged to have assisted in the alleged infringement is also to be subjected to these precautionary seizures. Why I'm mentioning this is there's tremendous crossover in all of these agreements. While that specific wording does not show up in the USMCA, because of these agreements sort of cross-cutting each other, it's not improbable that a U.S.-based corporation could exercise those kinds of draconian measures through CETA by being considered a Canadian corporation, in so much as the definition of corporations are any entity that has a substantive or continuous link with any economy. And we see these kinds of things happening with these trade agreements. So the sort of the spider's web, or the jail door that's being imposed on us, it's just not the USMCA, but it's this whole plethora that are coming together. And I guess that I'll just flip back to the agricultural chemicals. We see this in CETA. We've seen it in the past. The idea that data supplied by private companies is proprietary seems to be accepted. I'm not sure why. It's proprietary even when it's supplied to our regulatory bodies to approve their products. And what we have to, and in this agreement and in CETA, this proprietary information has to remain undisclosed for a minimum of 10 years, can be longer, but a minimum of 10 years. And this idea that property rights, whether it's intellectual property rights or data protection or whatever, that the public should not even have access to the information that their regulatory bodies are making their decisions on, I think is we really need to protest that, and I think it's completely unacceptable that we would move into a world where that sort of mechanism would be acceptable. And I'll close by saying patents, intellectual property, our regulatory agencies are what make these products valuable. If they are not approved by the public, by our governments, they have no value for these corporations. And the idea of patents is that you had a short-term privilege, it was a social contract, for a period of time given by the state, by citizens, for the innovator, for the full disclosure of the process of the invention and how it's done, so that anyone skilled in the art in the future, when that patent expired, it could be available. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing now is a perversion where property rights, simple property rights, are also being conflated with intellectual property rights, etc., and that this social contract element is completely forgotten about. And I think that we just have to remind our friends at Bayer and former Monsanto, etc., if it was not for us approving their products, they would have no value. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That was so much information there. There's a whole layer of anonymity too, that sets these agreements apart from, like back in the robber baron days. I think people kind of knew who the enemy was back then, and now it's, just the idea that a trade agreement, gives this blanket protection to corporations over the people and the planet it's just not right. So we're going to open up the lines for questioning, and we will of course invite Karen also. You may have a lingering question for Karen, or the two of you may wish to collaborate when you're answering a question. So please press *6 on your phone, and then the 1 when you are prompted, and you'll be put into the queue.
Okay, we do have a few people in the queue already, raring to go. Okay, Wendy, your line is open.
Thank you. It's Wendy Getz from Freeland Heights in New Jersey. And I love when Chris Hedges says Canada's been adopting all of our bad laws. But I feel so much of the frustration of our terrible laws and our terrible actions and its influence on you all as well. And I thank you for the entire presentation. Maybe is there a possibility or an opportunity for maybe a switching the laws that worked for you? Maybe we need some real progressive leaders in our legislators and municipal levels all the way up to the federal levels, maybe proposing things that worked for Canada earlier, and vice versa. Maybe Canada can use the COOL Act and, swap these laws that were good. Is there an opportunity for that? And thank you, Karen. Maybe you could answer that as well. And one more thought. Nature I think the documentation of the nature of your product and, your seed, your wheat, your rye, that should be the ultimate goal. And we can't commoditize nature at all. And we could accomplish that in a constitutional amendment, the Green Amendment, written by Maya Van Rosen, and we could get that in all of our states into our constitutions. Only Pennsylvania and Montana have it right now. So thanks so much. I'm sorry I rambled.
Thank you,
I'm
Wendy.
so tired. I was driving around. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Gary, would you like to tackle that one?
Oh, okay. Sure. Well, I think that, discussion and the adoption of good ideas is a great idea. On my pessimistic side, unfortunately, I've often said that bad ideas seem to never go away. but good ideas ultimately, things improve over time. I think we have a real problem right now in terms of education, in terms of feedback loops that keep presenting the same ideas, the same concepts via some universities, international institutions like the OECD and the World Bank, etc. And we have to just speak back to that sort of thing. And I think that becoming aware of as Wendy talked about, of good ideas in other places and dialogue that way amongst citizens is really a good idea, because lots of times we're just not aware of different ways of doing and thinking about things, even in this world of mass communication.
Yep. My understanding was that early in the 90s, the U.S. Farmers in the Midwest were pushing for the supply management system. They recognized that Canada had such a great program, and it didn't work out too well for those farmers. So.
No, unfortunately, it's rather like the loss of the institutions I talked about too. Very good institutions, but we lost them. We can rebuild.
Yeah. Karen, are you still with us?
I am. I guess, it's certainly true that U.S. farmers have pushed for supply management. In the last Farm Bill, what would that be, the 2008 Farm Bill, the U.S. National Farmers Union had this big plan. They called it MIDAS, the Market-Driven Inventory System, but it was supply management. It was food reserve. They were trying to get at it a different way, and they didn't get very far. But I think that they continue to raise those ideas, as do some other groups. So I think, it's still out there as an idea. I think, people know there is a lot of progress in different local food system work. And, as I said a little while ago, I am so inspired by what they want to do in Mexico to restore the countryside. So I think that's something, I hope we can get to better rules here. And in the meantime, I hope we can not block good reforms in Mexico.
And the other thing is, I wonder in Mexico, if they pass these wonderful reforms, if they'll be liable or vulnerable under this Chapter 28 of the regulatory review chapter. That could very well be,
They might, yeah.
Or not.
I think it's a real possibility. It's hard to know how it'll play out. I think they are certainly going to move forward with it and then see what happens. But it would, of course, be much better if they didn't have that risk there.
Well, I think we just have to stand. We just can't accept a trade agreement that has something like that in there. It's just, we can't make trade-offs some good things which may or may not be enforceable, and trade off Canada's grain grading or its supply management. You just can't trade off something like that. It's just not acceptable. So, next question.
Okay. Next question is from Alan. Your line is open.
Hi, this is Alan calling from Vancouver Island. I'm just wondering if the panel has any thoughts on how to defeat neoliberalism in general. And I'm wondering if they've been looking at the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, if at all possible.
Terry, would you like to start off with that one?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think that personally, one of my hobby horses has been the intellectual property piece, that GMOs and all of these other things wouldn't have hit the market and wouldn't have as quickly and allowed the accumulation of such wealth and power if, for example, we hadn't allowed these entities to be patentable. And it was very close that that didn't happen. I think that changing laws like that, exercising other laws that would break up some of these entities significantly. The sun would rise in the morning, and we'd still have food in the supermarkets, and we might even have better food. And the world will go on. We don't need monster players like that. As far as the Sustainable Development Goals go, I think a lot of people are probably not aware of them. I think that if we talk about these things, and unfortunately, the political machine is in Canada, and even more so in the U.S., is a difficult one to penetrate with radically different ideas. But nevertheless, we have to try, and sometimes even run for office if we can, even if it's unsuccessful, to just bring forward a different agenda, different ideas, have them discussed and dealt with. And of course, these kinds of things, like the Trade Justice Organization in Florida is doing, is really great in terms of allowing different ideas and information to be put out.
Thank you. We're not really Florida. We're national. We have people.
Oh.
I'm from Florida, but we have people
sorry.
from New. That's okay. That's okay. Okay.
I was thinking, what is that group? We got to get with them.
Yeah, we have to find those people.
Right?
Well, and the other thing right now is the CPTPP is moving very quickly. And what do the people of Canada think about that, Terry?
Unfortunately, most people think that trade agreements, just by attaching free trade or trade to it, is positive. There's been quite an indoctrination. Now, there's lots of activists and lots of people that know better and are opposed to these things. I think what a lot of people are really offended by is how these negotiations are conducted in secret and then presented as a fait accompli after the fact. When the Canada-U.S. trade agreement, the CUSTA and the Nafta were being negotiated, the text was actually available for the public to discuss. And how do we move into a place where it's now acceptable for our governments to negotiate in secret and in these agreements? And I think the people are quite disturbed about that.
very good question. And Karen, what about down in Mexico? What is the how do they look at the CPTPP? Do the people know very much about it down there?
Well, the Senate, the Mexican Senate, did approve the CPTPP.
Yeah.
I think about 6 months ago, and I think that was frustrating for the movements there. I think there hasn't been as much debate as people might hope in Mexico, although we did have a trinational meeting at the beginning of the talks that had several hundred people in the audience, and I think there have been mobilizations. I think they're in a tricky spot right now, though, because there are groups working on labor, on energy reform, on agriculture, that have some pretty solid commitments from the new AMLO administration for some good new programs. And honestly, that weakens the trade justice movement because people are focused in other ways. On the other hand, I mean, what I heard on agriculture is people are really planning to move forward with this program that probably will contradict the trade rules, and they just don't care. You know, they will deal with that when it comes. And so I think, in a sense, I mean, that's great, right? But it's a tough situation right now. I think their main demand is to get the text in English so there can be more of a public debate. That's their initial demand, which seems, such a modest thing to be asking for, but they don't have that yet. So it's a different moment there than it is here, and I think we, of course, are confronting our own particular political moment, but perhaps are getting more press than in the past on these issues.
Yeah. Do they have, you were talking about helping farmers. What about land redistribution? Because didn't a lot of the farmers in Mexico and Latin America lose their land? I mean, are they planning anything government subsidized land reform or anything like that? I just wondered if you knew.
There is some discussion of that. I asked, when they said like they would give these amazing support prices to farms under 5 hectares, I said, well, how do you know? Like, how do you know someone doesn't just divide up, a 20-hectare farm into 5 farms? And they said, oh, well, they've got it all geo-referenced. Like, they know who these people are. And what they say, is very openly is, this program they're proposing is not going to resolve all the problems. It's going to start, to turn the ship around. And they recognize, there need to be there's a lot of moving parts that need to come together, and certainly access to land is part of that. So, it is, like I said, it's this ambitious program, and they're figuring it out right now. So I have to think land reform will be part of it.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty exciting, actually. Any of us that have, or have been following these trade agreements for the last 25 to 30 years certainly recognize that Mexico really got the short end of the stick, especially with Nafta. So is there any other question for our speakers tonight?
We do. We have one more question. Caller, your line is open.
Yes, hello there. It's David Orchard speaking here from Saskatchewan. I'm also a farmer, like Terry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And I've been involved in battling free trade agreements for over 35 years. I wrote a book on the topic called Canada. But I wanted to add 2 questions. One, I wanted to ask Karen. She mentioned that the proportional sharing part of the energy is no longer there, and that's a plus, I think she said. But the proportional sharing part is in the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement of 1988. And what I'd like to know is, does she know whether or not that has actually been put in abeyance, or whether that Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement is still in effect? Because if it is, that proportional sharing arrangement is in that agreement before it was repeated in NAFTA. So that's what I'd like to ask her if she knows. And Terry, I wonder if you could say more specifically about the wheat arrangement and grains in general. What is going to, are they going to allow American wheat into Canada's system? And what's the exact situation? Is it just a grading, or does it involve more than that? And how does this change it from what it was under NAFTA? Thanks very much.
Okay.
Okay.
Karen, do you want?
Yep.
Well, so on the first question, my understanding is that if this new NAFTA 2.0 USMCA were approved, then the provisions in that would override what were in previous trade agreements in the same way that NAFTA overrode some of the rules in the original U.S.-Canada agreement. Now, if it were to fail, then there's a lot of discussion about exactly what would happen. But my understanding is it would override what was in previous deals.
Would that mean there's no mention of it at all? Would that mean there's nothing to override? I mean, if there's nothing in terms of energy in this new agreement, and so where did all of that go? Proportional sharing of energy, that still.
There may be others. I haven't focused on that area very specifically. I'm mainly relying on analysis from Sierra Club. My understanding is, though, that the new energy chapter is pretty comprehensive, and so I think it would have been included there exactly what would happen. But I'm sorry, I'm not the expert on that particular clause. But I believe it is overridden in this agreement, in the energy chapter, yeah.
But there is no energy chapter that I can find. Did you find one?
Is it an annex of one of the other chapters? I could look it up. I'll be happy to send around something, but I would urge people to look at Sierra Club's material on that. I know there is at least an annex on energy, because I know that was the one area that the AMLO administration did insist on some changes towards the end of the negotiations. But I haven't followed precisely where they're located. I bet Stan or somebody or Adam or someone else on the call might know that, though.
Yes, if you know what section where it could be found, because I'm unable to find it.
Thank you. If someone else has more familiarity with the energy chapter or annex, you could press *6 and we'll put you in the queue. Meanwhile, we'll go and answer the second part of the question on U.S. wheat access. Yep.
Okay. Hi, David. If the agreement is ratified, the U.S. grain has to be treated under our grading. It's to my reading of the agreement, at this point it's just U.S. wheat. They aren't specifying other grains, but U.S. wheat has to be, if it meets the grading parameters that we have, has to be treated the same. It cannot be differentiated from Canadian wheat if it's brought into the Canadian system. So that, of course, does make it difficult for us to brand a Canadian product as a premium product, and in terms of differentiating in the marketplace, although a lot of that has been lost, as you well know, since we lost the Canadian Wheat Board, and it's now multinational companies that are selling our grain, and we don't know exactly how they're identifying it. But so their varieties have to be treated the same as we would treat the equivalent varieties in Canada, and if they meet our grading specifications, we can't differentiate. Whereas in the past, we downgraded U.S. wheat could come into the country, but it was graded at the lowest grade, and so that didn't make it interesting for U.S. exporters particularly. And that's my understanding at this point of how it would function.
Thank you. We have another questioner in the queue.
We do. We have two more people. Caller at 413, your line is open.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you sound great.
Hi, this is Maxine, and I think I answered my own question. I was wondering where you got the Sierra Club information, and I just Googled it, and I think it's NAFTA 2.0 for people or polluters document on their website. So
great.
I think
Hi,
I think
Maxine.
I found it.
How are you?
Hi, good, Harriet. Thank you.
Maxine is one of my Florida buddies down here. So, yeah, funny I didn't recognize it. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Max.
Okay. Caller at area code 520, your line is open.
520, your line is open.
You probably muted yourself. It's a cell phone, but there's no name. No?
I'm muted. Okay, here I am.
There you are.
There you are.
Yay!
So I have a question that's kind of related to the energy issue indirectly, but Terry alluded to some issues around intersectionality between the trade agreements and climate change, our abilities to address climate change nationally and internationally. I wonder if you could talk more about some of those ideas. How do they relate to each other?
Well, one of the problems is like we can regulate and we can pass laws in the public interest, but if they're deemed to be tantamount to expropriation, which means any sort of effect on the profitability of a corporation, the respective governments are expected to compensate, and this interconnectedness of agreements. This is part of CETA. And for the first time, this agreement penetrates right down to the municipal level. So it's the Canadian national, provincial, and municipal levels that the agreement applies to. So even something like tendering for, a renovation in a school, if it exceeds a certain financial threshold, it has to be posted internationally in CETA for Canada. Now, the thing I was talking about in Europe, in Canada, in an assortment of these agreements, the actual home base of a corporation is rather fluid. If they have branch offices or if they have what's defined in the CETA agreement, a substantive or continuous link with any economy in the agreement, they're identified as, for example, a European corporation, even if they're U.S. based. So then they could use that agreement to via Europe to go after Canada as an example for passing environmental legislation of one sort or the other if it impacted the profitability of that corporation in terms of whatever it might be in terms of what the products they're selling or restricted the products that they're selling and impacted their profitability. So And there's some very real examples of these kinds of things taking place, including a combination of agreements where a Swedish company is actually able to sue the German government for closing down nuclear power plants via the back door of these layered agreements. We have some experience with Nafta, of course, with the old Chapter 11 in Canada. But these arrangements are very strong, and particularly the European Commission is very aggressive. They're not the friendly European entity that people think about in terms of maximizing corporate interests and restricting what governments can do unless they're willing to pay for it. And the other problem is that there's a very select group of arbitrators, parties in these agreements where a dispute takes place, can select from a very small pool of arbitrators that are actually giving huge rewards to the corporate sector. And each party can select one, and then another one is selected for them. And this is what's very worrying about all of these agreements, sort of layering on top of each other. When you get, Canada in this European trade agreement, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then this very loose definition of what a European, what a Canadian, what a U.S. corporation actually is for the purposes of the agreement, and then their ability to exercise privileges through the back door or the front door through an assortment of agreements.
Wow.
Thank you very much. Kind of scary.
Oh. Yeah.
Karen, did you want to comment at all, or shall we move on to the next? We have one more person in the queue.
Let's just move on. That'd be fine.
Okay.
Okay. Mary, your line is open.
Hi, this is Mary calling from Elgin, Illinois. What chance do we have of defeating this Mexican-American trade agreement in the U.S. Congress right now? When we were fighting the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we had months in which to educate ourselves and lobby our members of Congress, and we had a pretty clear understanding of what the talking points were. And now, with all the chaos going on, I don't think our members of Congress have any chance to pay attention to what's in this trade agreement. And, I'm doubting my own ability to lobby my congressman about it because I'm confused myself. When I did try to speak with my congressman's office, they were very confused. They had this notion, free trade good, and that's all they could think of. They did not understand when I tried to talk to them about investor-state dispute settlement. What chance do we have of stopping this thing?
Karen, would you like to go attack that question?
Well, it's a really good question. I would start by saying, we all defeated the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the U.S., not Trump.
Right.
So there has been a lot of work done already among many members, although, of course, it needs to continue, and hopefully we will have many new members coming in pretty soon. Our best guess is that a vote could happen in February or March. This is all guesswork at this point, but that's what most people I talk to seem to think is likely. So it's not a lot of time. And the other issue, I think the hardest issue right now, or one hard issue, is that the thing really isn't done yet. It's not clear. One of the key questions is what comes out of the labor chapter and whether it really is enforceable and what position U.S. unions then take based on that. So that is a really key question. I think other parts of the agreement are still moving. I saw one article I was looking at in the agriculture chapter was gone one day and then it was back the next in the online text. So I think it's a moving target still. So I think there's that challenge. It's not really done yet. I think on the other hand, many of us signed a letter that Citizens Trade Campaign put out at the start of the talks. There were 1,000 organizations that endorsed that, and I think that gives us sort of a guidepost to assess this by. So that there will be that. But it is, I worry that we might not be unified this time, depending on what comes out with the labor agreement, the labor chapter, and I don't know about that yet. So I think what I hear most groups saying, many groups, are saying we need to press on these changes that need to happen, particularly in labor, but in other things as well. Some groups, like environmentalists, have kind of thrown their hands up already and said this is not going to work. I think, our perspective is on agriculture, it is not going to make things any better for U.S. farmers, and it is actively worse for Canadian and Mexican farmers. But so it is a challenge, but I think we really should not forget that it wasn't Trump who defeated the Trans-Pacific Partnership here. It was us. And a lot of that work, a lot of that groundwork has been built.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very satisfying answer.
Thank you, Mary. And okay. Well, I think our speakers probably have a long day ahead of themselves tomorrow, and we want to thank you, Karen Hansen-Kuhn and Terry Baum, for spending your Sunday evening with us. We really appreciate it, and we always look to your expertise as we work to educate ourselves and our constituents about the realities of these trade agreements. And, we really do need to work together, and it's important to know your talking points and write letters to the editor and talk to your representatives because it's really important. They're ultimately going to make the decision about these trade agreements. So thank you very much. And now thank you. If you all want to, Karen and Terry, want to stay with us and use the chat, please do. But we're going to move on now. So I just wanted to remind everyone that we will be sending out the video of this presentation later on this week. And just so you know, you can access all of our videos produced by Carrie. She takes the audio and visuals and somehow turns them into videos. And to access all of our videos, you can go to tradejustice.net/webinar-vids, and you can access all of them. So thanks to Carrie for doing that for us. Also, we could really use your help right now. There are so many issues in these trade agreements, and right now we are working, in this NAFTA too, and we could use your help. We organize webinars, we promote, we can use people to help promote, to run the webinar rooms themselves, to recruit speakers, and just to, get ideas about, the topics for the webinars. We expect to have one more webinar before December, and that one we're still working on. We're thinking we will connect the migrant crisis that is occurring from Latin America right now, and connect that to the sustainable food movement, and that will be later on in the month of November. So if you would like to join us, you can email me, Harriet, at tradejustice.net. And we'd love to have you. We have planning calls on Wednesday evenings, and that they are at 8 Eastern Time. And we talk about the possibilities for webinars and other issues too. Also, if you would like to help us out, you can donate to us at tradejustice.net/TJA donate, and we wouldn't turn down a few dollars if you'd like to throw a little bit in the kitty. And also, keeping in the spirit of the season, I know that everyone on this webinar tonight understands it's voting season, and I would like to share this little tool that I just got from Andrea Miller, the Executive Director of People Demanding Action. She sent me this. It's called an election protection tool. You just there's a bit.ly link, and you can report any suspicious activity at your polls. It's really kind of cool. You can find this on the webinar when on our Trade Justice, or on the PowerPoint that we put out on our Trade Justice Alliance Facebook group. And it also has a CSA reporter map. So once you make a report, you'll see it on the map. You can verify it. So basically, that's kind of a neat little thing. And last but not least, we want to acknowledge that, we know there are lots of places you could be tonight, Sunday night, and so we really want to thank you very much for choosing to spend your Sunday night with us, and especially now during this very, very busy time before the election. So we want to thank you. We're very grateful and honored that you have chosen to spend your time with us. So thank you all so much, and good night from Trade Justice Alliance. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Great
everybody.
webinar.
Thank you.
Harry. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you,
Thank
Harriet.
you. Don't forget to vote, everybody.